Hello everyone. As I said in my introduction video, I'm Griffin. I had a great first discussion with you all, so I'm really excited to participate in this one as well. I found this chapter very interesting, and since it was the first chapter, I was expecting it to be more of like a refresher on things I already knew. However, I was pleasantly surprised that a lot of the information that was presented to me was new information that I hadn't learned before. The first question I chose to answer was question number 1, and I think I would define racism as the mistreatment of someone of another race because you think your own race is superior, or believing that certain characteristics are specific to that race only. When answering the second part of the question about how the idea of race is linked to racism, this might be kind of obvious, but I would say that race is linked to racism because without race there really wouldn't be racism. They kind of go hand in hand. The idea of racism is based on race. In the first chapter of our textbook on page 2, I learned that people were not always divided into race, and so before the idea of race was a thing, there really wasn't much racism. I do believe that if the idea of race was not a thing, people would still discriminate against one's religion or gender or other things like that. But without race, I don't think there is a possibility of having racism. Along with race being needed to have racism, I believe the ideology that your race is superior also needs to be there. On page 6 of the chapter, it mentions that although there was slavery in ancient times, the Greeks and the Romans admired the culture and the way of life of the Egyptians and Ethiopians. So although the Greeks and Romans were using slaves, they were not just using them because of their darker skin color. And maybe I'm way off with this first question, so I'd love to hear some of your thoughts and opinions, and if you guys want to reply. The second question I wanted to address was the question regarding the slave codes. As stated on page 14 of chapter 1, slave codes clearly spell out the differences between African slaves and European indentured servants. In the late 17th century, Virginia and Maryland passed laws that solidified the status of the Africans, such as the prohibition of manumission, and this made it so masters could not free their slaves, and this established a permanent slave class for Africans. Other laws that were passed made interracial marriage forbidden and limited the rights of black people to own property and bear arms. And leading up to this point, African slaves and European indentured servants shared similar social classes, but these slave codes began to change this because these laws took away the rights of African slaves, but also made the European indentured servants feel more superior because they had rights that the Africans did not. The slave codes were intended to disrupt the relationships between African slaves and Europeans, and these laws were established to create a new class of people who were specifically for working and hard labor. The laws separated white servants and black slaves to prevent any other events similar to Bacon's Rebellion from occurring. And the laws were enforced such that English servants who ran away with African slaves were severely punished. And in my opinion, I get the idea behind slave codes and that they were implemented to prevent another rebellion. However, I do not agree with them, and I think these laws are what began the idea that people of European descent are superior than those that aren't. And these laws were unfair and basically took away all rights from the African slaves. I mean, slavery in itself was a bad thing, but to take away all human rights, that was horrible, and I think that these laws are what did that. And then bringing this back to the first question, before these slave codes, slavery wasn't based solely upon the color of one's skin, but I think these slave codes are what officially broke people up into distinct races. And maybe if these laws weren't passed, people would still discriminate against one's culture or where they're from, but I think these slave codes are what made racism mainly based upon the color of one's skin. But maybe you guys disagree, and you can share your opinions if you want to reply. And I hope I made sense throughout this whole video. And I'm excited to hear your guys' opinions and thoughts and watch your guys' videos as well. Thank you.